Okay, so we now have all our speakers. So welcome back, and let's kick off the fourth session of the day, which is entitled Digital Identities. Why do they matter for 21st century trade? And what does DLT, so distributed ledger technology, mean for digital identities? And with top-notch experts for this session that will make us dive into the world of digital identities and why digital identities and identifiers are important for international trade. It's a topic, as I said, that was mentioned this morning already. Now Oswald Carolyn moderated. Oswald is the managing director of the ICC Digital Standards Initiative that was launched a few months ago. And he's also the former head of data strategy at BHP, which is the world's largest diversified mining company. He's worked on initiatives covering blockchain, electronic documentation in trade, data and analytics, and automation. So over to you, Oswald.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. What a privilege it is to be hosting this panel today. I want to welcome everyone to what I believe is going to be a very informative session. For this segment, we'll cover a very foundational topic, digital identities and why do they matter in 21st century trade. It's a central topic that means many different things to many different people, and it's easy to get lost. The technologists in me think about standards like ISO 24760, which articulates a set of attributes for digital identities, or even the W3C's DID specification. When I put my trade hat on, I think about all the other identities that we see externally, from the WCO's TIN, SWIFT's BIC, Glyph's LEI, and the list goes on. It's easy to feel a little bit overwhelmed by all these acronyms, yet they enable trillions of dollars of trade today. Now, the good news is we're only at the starting point. There are still many, many more identities and identifiers that are required for both subjects and objects, companies and transport, to enable all of the additional value that's out there in the world. So today we're going to take you through a little bit of an accelerated journey. We're going to talk about what they are. We're going to talk a little bit about what the value is. We'll talk a bit about the landscape and the diversity in that, and finally get a little bit of a call to action at the end. Friendly reminder, we have a Q&A section at the end of the actual panel. So if you have any questions, please do raise them. Preface it with the word question. It's easier for me to pick them up, and I'll definitely make sure we include those at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce our fantastic panelists. We have Chris Bellinger from Moby, who's joined us today. Thanks, Chris. Nadia Hewitt from the World Economic Forum. Nadia, it's a privilege to have you here. And Hendrik Jensen from ATR. So thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the audience. Raise your questions and let's do this. So I'm going to start off the first question, Hendrik, by pulling you into the conversation. So Hendrik, from an audience perspective, again, digital identity can feel very challenging to truly understand what it all is. Can you give the audience a macro level view of what it is and what it covers? Over to you, Hendrik.
And thank you very much, Oswald. And I will try to do that in a few minutes, as we talked about. So, but basically, I mean, next slide, please. No, this is fine. Sorry. I mean, in Denmark, we had a digital identity and a digital signature for citizens, businesses, and government agencies for almost 20 years. And when we have seen how important this has been for efficient digitization and streamlining of the Danish society, it is actually fairly frustrating when you come behind the curtains in global trade to see how costly it is of not having a similar opportunity for global trade. I mean, it has implications on the poverty in the world, and on implications on cost and risk for anyone involved in global trade. So what I promise here, the purpose of my 5 minutes here, is to give an overview of what is a digital identity and a digital signature, and why is this a foundation prerequisite for efficient digitization of global trade. I mean, I will argue that without a common digital trade identity and signature, we will never be able to harvest the full benefits of a digital global trade. We will be not even close to do that. Next slide, please. It is fundamental in any relationship that you can prove your identity and that you can trust the other party's identity. And it's even more important when you have future global trade, where the number of digital connections will increase dramatically, and your digital global trade ecosystem continuously will be adjusted dynamically. I mean, your digital capability needs to be prepared for that. So if we look at what is a digital identity, this is what the slide shows here. I mean, it's a digital equivalent of a person's or an entity's real identity. So you have an identity in the real world. It's used for identification of digital transactions and the connections you have. You may think of this in terms of a user ID and password on the home page, but the main focus on what we're talking about here is system-to-system interactions, where your IT system communicate directly with other parties' IT system, and both IT systems are able to verify the identity of the entity the IT system is acting on behalf of. I tried to illustrate a digital identity on the right. It is actually fairly simple. The important part is that there exists a third party that both entities trust. This can also be a friend of a friend concept, where you trust a local party and you trust what this local party trusts. So it's one single global trusted party for all of global trade. It's not necessary. We can have local parties involved as well. The important thing is that you trust that third party, that the third party has verified and continue to verify the identity and relevant credentials for each party. The trusted third party then issue a digital identity, and during an interaction with your business partner, you present this digital identity to the other party that can ask this third party to verify this identity. This is how digital identities work, so it is actually fairly simple. Next slide, please. A very critical part of a digital identity is your digital signature. It's not enough to tell who you are, but actually also be able to sign documents and transactions, to digital sign documents and transactions that can be handed out throughout the value chain. Also, the digital signature concept is actually fairly simple. In this example here, we have an exporting authority that needs to sign the trade document. It could, for example, be in a certificate of origin. The way the digital signature works is that you first, a unique code is calculated of the document, of this trade document, of the certificate of origin. It is encrypted with the export authority's private key. You then send this to the importing authority in this example here. The importing authority decrypts this unique code with the exporting authority's public key, and then recalculate the received document's unique code. If the decrypted and the recalculated code is the same, you know the document hasn't been changed. So it is fairly simple. Of course, there's a lot of very advanced mathematics behind, but the technology is ready. Next slide, please. So it's also important to underline that a digital signed document is significantly more secure than traditional paper-based signatures. I mean, it is way more secure. You cannot forge a digital signed trade document. The validity of the authorization is verified immediately by your IT systems. You can use it in both government to government, business to government, business to business interactions. And when you receive a digital signed document, and actually it doesn't matter who actually gives it to you, but when you receive this digital signed document, you can verify that it has been issued by an authorized agency, that the document hasn't been tampered with, and that only authorized entities has access. All this is given to you by the digitization. Next slide, please. So global trade requires interaction between a lot of different parties that is often assembled dynamically. For example, during the investigation for emerged trade lanes, we identified that more than 20 entities was involved in a container transport. It is costly, takes time, and increased security risk if you need to have a separate identity per service provider, and the digital signature cannot be globally recognized. The only way to enable efficient, trustworthy global trade is by implementing a globally recognized digital identity and signature that is used in global trade. Next slide, please. So in order for realizing a true global identity. I work with Nadia from World Economic Forum, that is also on the panel here, on how can we design this one here. And this is, and you can find the details in the document. We identified a number of principles for enabling global interoperability while preserving the political and competitive neutrality. I highlighted a number of principles. There's more in the document, but basically, the important is that you need to be able to decide yourself how much trust you put on the presenter identity and signature. It cannot be a third party deciding for that one. Also, the control of your identity must be with you. You cannot again have a third party controlling your identity. We of course also need to accept there is different jurisdiction around the globe. So again, each jurisdiction can decide how they will trust the presented identity and credentials. We also need to make sure that the cost for participation must be limited, and we cannot give the power to a single organization to control the infrastructure. So this is also part of the governance and the design that a single organization cannot control the infrastructure. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. I hope I've given you an understanding of why global trade identity is a foundation prerequisite for efficient digitization of global trade. And also that the technology is ready, it's actually well tested. Basically, next step is just to make the decision and start now. Thank you very much, Osman.
Thank you so much, Hendrik. I want to pull in Chris from Moby. So I think, Chris, for a few people, it's quite easy to think about identity and think about people and think about companies and correlate the two to each other. Can you potentially help the audience to understand, for example, the identity of things and where that comes in, and specifically a little bit more about what Moby is doing in that space?
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here this evening, or this morning, my time. So we're all familiar with identity and its role in allowing people to access things that they can't access, right? It's a human identity, a secure human identity that gives them access to the banking system, allows them to own property, participate in the economy, own a business, and maximize their human capital. It's similar for things. Things which have identities can have the identity can act as an anchor to other very valuable data, and that valuable data can help solve the lemons problem, the problem of asymmetry in information in marketplaces that make markets less efficient and destroy value. A digital identity for a thing can turn almost anything, can give almost anything a lot more value. We've seen it recently with the NFTs. Now, maybe that's NFTs as non-fungible tokens, which have taken digital files for artwork, right, and turned them into multi-billion dollar digital attributes and assets. We've seen it with Bitcoin, but potentially with anything, you can give it a digital ID and turn it into a bearer instrument and give it value. And if the thing is smart and connected, you can turn that physical thing into a participant in the economy, right? An IoT device, which is smart, has a certain requisite amount of intelligence, processing power, can begin to transact on its own. In fact, so the convergence that we're seeing of blockchain, of AI, of IoT, right, allows anything, any smart thing to have an identity and to begin to participate increasingly autonomously in a transaction economy. And that is something I think that is going to revolutionize a lot of industries, including supply chains and global trade.
Thank you so much, Chris. That really helped. So what I want to do is I want to transition a little bit over to Nadia. We've just spoken a little bit about the identity of objects and subjects. Nadia, when I think a bit about the diversity of audience members that we have today, we have everyone from policymakers, trade officials, executives at companies. And I wonder if you can help, now that we have a sense of what identity is, give people a view on basically why it matters, what's important about identity and what's an offer for them, and maybe specifically for policymakers and trade officials.
Yes, thank you, Oswald. Hey, everybody, lovely to be with you. So the whole world lived the last week through the realities of supply chain disruptions that international trade entities faces quite regularly. And I'm talking about the vessel that was stuck sideways in the Suez Canal. Disruptions this caused should unfortunately be too familiar to policymakers and trade officials, right? There is fog in the port of Savannah or port of Shanghai, the COVID-19 pandemic causing disruptions. There are strikes in Montreal or other ports. Importers and exporters need to rely on alternative and many times new vendors and suppliers overnight during times of disruption. This is where policymakers need to develop new ways to promote trust and agile supply chains to sustain trade and mitigate such disruptions. Global trusted digital identity systems can be the key to unlock the trust and agility that is essential to make international trade resilient. This is, of course, not only important during disruptions, but it is also essential for day-to-day trade activities. If I had to summarize just real quick what Henrik and Chris introduced, it really comes down to the fact that identity and trust lie at the core of each trade interaction, right? So we want to be able to answer questions like, what suppliers can I trust? Are these new vendors compliant? Do these suppliers meet KYC and anti-money laundering requirements? We want to be able to answer these questions reassuringly and in an effective manner. So really, as transactions and deal making is becoming more digital, trade entities need to efficiently link that digital identity to a real organization and do it in a way that's agile and effective. So as trade officials, Oswald, and policymakers are rethinking processes and trade agreements relevant to digital identity verification, I think the question, also this being a blockchain forum, the question that comes to mind is, what can blockchain bring in particularly to small and medium-sized enterprises? SMEs have come up quite a bit in the last few hours or today. The thing is that supplier verification processes, so digital identification processes, are currently performed in centralized silos. Different public and private solutions, they record, maintain, and verify identity data, and they do it potentially hundreds of times over. These are not interoperable, and it's creating a significant amount of redundant identity information and just, duplicative efforts. This is a waste of resources for all parties involved, but it is also error-prone, paper-heavy, and it's difficult to scale. And this creates specific challenges for small and medium-sized enterprises. It's a lot more costly to them. Think about it, the same process, the same information, the same cost that an SME has to go through every time they do a supplier verification is the same that a large exporter goes through. So clearly SMEs are at a disadvantage when compared with more regular reputable brands as far as conducting trustworthy supplier verification processes. So for trade officials, helping them to reduce red tape when doing business abroad by streamlining such costly digital identity verification processes empowers SMEs to have more agile responses to business opportunities. And then I'll just lastly say the advent of blockchain technology, it has opened new opportunities to improve and rethink and reimagine these digital identity systems. Because of blockchain synchronized and tamper-proof characteristics, blockchain can help to enhance trust, but it also enables the decentralized holding of information, unlike the traditional databases, if you think about digital identity. So really, I would say, first and foremost, improved digital identity systems is key in supporting SMEs.
Thank you so much, Nadia, and that really helps. And to build off what you've just shared with the audience, I wonder if we can bring Hendrik back. So Hendrik, Nadia touched a little bit on the business side of things too, and the impact from a cost perspective, etc. What's your take from a business landscape point of view? Why should business executives worry about digital identity?
I would say, I mean, it's three things, or perhaps four things, but it is saving on cost, on time, and on risk, and also basically to remain competitive. I mean, if you look at the cost, for example, I mean, McKinsey reports show that the financial industry will save something like $2 to $4 billion on what is called the Global Legal Entity Identifier, the GLIE. But basically not having to register, protect, and maintain the identities registered in your IT system, as well as the identities that you are registered under other companies' IT system, will be an enormous cost saver and will increase security. I mean, you only have your identity placed one, you only have your digital signature in one place. I mean, when I left Maersk, we talked about having something like 50,000 foreign identities registered. This has probably increased significantly. But this is similar numbers for anyone else involved in global trade. This is a considerable hidden trade cost, as Nadia has also talked about, that can be removed. And if we look at the time aspect, I mean, setting up the identity of a new digital customer today can take weeks or months because you need to make sure this really is the right person, etc., or the right company. Now it's done immediately. Also, you're removing or at least reducing a complex activity when you develop new IT systems that need to interact with the ecosystem. And also when we talked about the risk, I mean, you know, and you're confident that the identities and digital signature that is presented to you are protected with world-class security. Both your identity, which is obviously important that is protected, but also your business partners. So you don't have to rely on a business partners protecting your identity properly. You control your own identity. And also competitiveness, I mean, to me, I cannot see that you can do business in global trade without having a digital identity and a signature. Because, I mean, we are in a world of digital interaction. I mean, you need to reduce the hassle of interaction digital with you. So if a business partner can do immediate digital interactions with you, where it takes several weeks to set up a competitor, you get the business. So basically, I would say doing it now will benefit you today, but it's also preparing you for the digital future.
Thank you. And I must say, I fully agree with you. I don't know how businesses stay competitive if they actually don't own the digital identity journey. And I don't know personally how you reach any of your KYC, KYS objectives without going down that path.
No.
And so I want to bring Chris from Mobi back. And for those of you who don't know, Mobi is the Mobility Open Blockchain Initiative. And Chris, you've actually worked on an identity standard. So I think it'll be really good if you can give us a view of the business case and some further insight into this whole identity process from your perspective. Chris, you're on mute.
Thank you. This early in the morning, it's hard to remember those little things. Thanks. Mobi is a nonprofit consortium that includes some of the world's largest automakers, big tech companies, lots of startups, governments, academics, and has upwards of 100 members now, roughly equally split between Asia, Europe, and the Americas. It's very focused on digital IDs and applying blockchain distributed ledger to transportation to make transportation greener, safer, more affordable, generally better. The ID, it was the fundamental use case. Just like with people, if people have a secure digital ID, it's a birth certificate or a social security number or whatever it is in each country. But what that ID does is it acts as an anchor to other metadata that makes transactions with that person more transparent, safer, more trusted. Same with things, same with vehicles. A secure digital ID for a vehicle can anchor information like location in space and time, the capabilities of the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle, therefore the damage it might do to a road. And these kinds of attributes create all kinds of interesting use cases and opportunities. For example, right, if you can combine a secure ID with location, with the characteristics of the vehicle, you can pay as you go for mobility. So suddenly you've taken the $27 trillion of the world's transportation infrastructure, which is not tollable, right? Not possible to marginal cost price, and therefore it's a public good today. And you've made it tollable. You've enabled marginal cost pricing, so you can apply now an efficient market to it. What does that do? It creates a totally new source of public finance for infrastructure, right? You can wipe out this problem of infrastructure deficit financing, the fact that it's stranded capital for generations for some of the infrastructure projects. You can enable opportunities for insurance companies and pay-as-you-go insurance, where the real marginal risk is actually what's being underwritten. You can congestion price. You can have green zones in cities where you only allow electric vehicles. You can create subsidies for electric vehicles. You can charge for carbon footprint as you go for vehicles, and so on and so on and so on. There's just an enormous amount of use cases and opportunity because you can connect the interesting metadata with the ID. And the same is true not only for vehicles, but in every industry, in shipping and supply chains, in global trade. It makes the markets more efficient and the transactions more trusted.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I'm going to do a little bit of promotion on your behalf. For the members in the audience, if you want to get a little bit more insight into identity standards for vehicles, have a look at dlt.mobi. I really think it's important. And the reason I'm sharing that, Chris, is because one of the challenges that I'm constantly worried about is fragmentation. So for those of you who don't know, my key objective at the DSI is to find a way for us to deal with all the digital islands that we have in international trade and actually enable the sharing of information between all of them. And so I can't help it when I look at the identity landscape, have a little bit of a similar worry within me of all of these different organizations kind of defining their own identities within their supply chains. And what are we going to do once we hit a point of a certain level of scale? So what I was thinking about is to go into a very similar conversation again on fragmentation. And Hendrik, I'm not sure if potentially you can help the audience. Just give them a macro level view of the actual identity landscape.
Again, I can try, but as you also say, man, the situation today is that, I mean, everyone have their own identity model, basically. I mean, there's a number of different initiatives. We have GLIVE, as I talked about, for the financial sector. I mean, WCO have the trade identification number. EU has the EORI number for all the AEOs in the European Union. I mean, there is SWIFT BIC code. GS1 has a code for partners in logistics supply chains. I mean, there's a lot of identities out there. One thing maybe I just should highlight is also that they do not all have a digital signature attached to them, which is, as I mentioned before, is important. But even though all these initiatives is there, it doesn't change the fact that everyone has their own. I mean, if you look at Maersk, MSC, Costco, CMA, I mean, they are requiring you to create an identity with them if you want to start booking digital container shipping. And the software we've seen with TradeLens, for example, they are using IBM IDs. Intra have their own IDs. Same goes for TT Nexus and Cargo Smart's Global Shipping Business Network. And all the other different software parts. I mean, they typically do have their own identity scheme, which is a challenge. And as Nadia has also mentioned, it is a significant hidden trade cost. I also see that a lot of reports has been created. I mean, I talked about the World Economic Forum report, that a white paper that we have, that Nadia and I worked on. it also include a call to action for the industry to act now, because I mean, again, as I said before, it is somehow frustrating. I mean, the technology is ready, the business case is clear for the industry. So next step for me is just the industry should start to go and do it. Also because I mean, if you see that a side effect to the digitization is that we are reducing trade barriers, and trade barriers gives more trade volume, which is of course for the shipping industry. So again, another reason for the industry to accelerate this one here, because it gives more business for them. I did also write an article on the World Economic Forum's blog on how digitization also will reduce crime, for example, forgery and corruption, as I mentioned before. So both things add to the positive business case for the industry players. So in addition to, I did mention the risk, the cost, and the time, the direct benefits for the industry, you actually get the side effects of increased trade volume and less crime. And this is just important. So even though there's many different initiatives, I mean, we need something to bridge it, but the technology is ready. So I can just repeat, I mean, just do it.
Mm-hmm.
I like the just do it attitude. I think fully aligned on that. So I'm going to pull in Nadia and Chris on this. So Nadia, let's potentially go to you first. So again, from a policymaker's perspective, what's your view? What should they consider when thinking about identity within either their countries or their regions? And how big of a risk is this diverse landscape that we're finding ourselves in?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. What should trade officials consider as they think through this? I would say, first of all, policy makers and trade should look outside, and I see there's already some questions to that in the chat box. But look even beyond trade, look at other industries and sector as inspiration for what they're doing. I think you'll see that this is not isolated to trade, right? This is not just a trade issue. Digital and trust lays at the foundation of any and all industries. And you will see that policymakers in other sectors understand the foundational role that identity and trust plays. In some sectors, policymakers are already further down the path of maturity. If we look at some examples, the world of travel is looking at, right? There's digital passwords that has been worked on for travelers, human travelers. Now they're including health officials in that discussion to see how you can actually attach vaccine and other health-related features to such a verified and trusted digital identity. In a way, that's the same for trade, right? You have a trusted digital identity that's mutually trusted and verified between countries. You actually can now start attaching features to that digital identity. So in the whole digitization of trade documents process, all kinds of features can be attached to a digital identity. Do they have an export license? Is an AGOA certificate for duty-free issued against this digital identity for the shipment? There's just, so instead of then handling documentation separately, just imagine a world where you know you're doing business with, you can trust that identity, you can effectively and in an agile way mutually verify the trustworthiness, but now you can also attach all these features that are documentation points in documents. You can attach that and share that very easily with that digital identity. Another example, I saw it came up in the chat, the legal entity identifier, LEI, maybe just for everybody who's not familiar with that. Basically, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, regulators worldwide acknowledged the problems stemming from their inability to identify parties to transactions across markets, projects, and regions. As a result, after the financial crisis, the financial sector advocated and then developed this universal legal entity identifier, the LEI. And that's applicable to any legal identity that engages in financial transactions. And there's a lot written about the positive impact of that development. So that's another example outside of trade, but also very relevant and that one can build on within trade. And then, so I have to mention, but I mean, look no further than your LinkedIn account. in the world of job hunting, right, and professional expertise, LinkedIn has become some sort of decentralized way for parties to share and verify trustworthy identity information with built-in reputational systems. Maybe not the greatest example, but so other sectors, industries are working through this as well, and there's a lot we can learn from as trade officials. I would say the second thing for trade officials to consider is that, and really understand that as it pertains to developing effective and trustworthy digital identity systems, that, and Hendrik said it, technology now allows us to do things that were not possible before. I mean, within the blockchain context, if you just think about bringing in smart contracts, it can allow us to automate and do things with digital identities in trade that just simply wasn't possible before. So technology, coupled with the right policies and collaboration, can be a key enabler then for collaborative parties. And then Oswald, you had a last part to that question. I think you were talking about the risk of the divergent landscape, right? So yeah, so there are some challenges to consider in implementing, global digital identity systems. And I think that's where the emergence of decentralized identity systems in comparison to centralized digital identity systems, the decentralized ones like blockchain, it holds a unique opportunity for trade officials, government, supply chain organizations to create systems that caters for future and forward-looking trade interactions. But that, yes, it requires that governments in collaboration with the industry enables a concept in which government identities, signatures, and verifiable credentials are mutually recognized across regions and ultimately globally. And a critical point, of course, is to ensure that the systems are interoperable and mutually recognized. This is not just a technology question. This is about, do I trust the processes that the other country is going through? We're seeing the same thing play out in the travel world, where it's, the technology is kind of easy to put in place to recognize the COVID vaccine has happened when a traveler enters another country. It comes back to the essential question of trust, right? And processes. Does one country trust the labs and the tests and the processes of another country? So this just expands way beyond this, the technology interoperability piece, but also to putting in place the criteria, the processes, and going back to really trust being sort of the cornerstone of something like this.
Thank you so much, Nadia. It reminds me of one of my mentors in the very beginning of the blockchain journey. Framed to me, he said, the internet gave us connectivity, blockchain gives us trust. And if I think about the identity conversation in blockchain, it really excites me. So Chris, I'm gonna head over to you. So I'm imagining quite a few executives sitting there, either looking at their warehouses or their supply chains, etc., and just knowing that there's a lot of value to be had if they actually were able to leverage digital identity in these new modern ways. So what would your advice be to them? How do they navigate this landscape?
So I'll give a don't do and a do here. Do go and join a consortium. Don't go and do another POC in a silo. I'll go back to maybe something you said about fragmentation and in explaining why I say that. Before any revolutionary technology can have an impact, there need to be standards, there need to be common definition, there need to be agreed ways of doing things. Language is a standard, money is a standard, right? What did God do in Genesis when he wanted to punish man for being too ambitious? He took away their common tongue, right, in the Tower of Babel, right? So they couldn't communicate anymore. There has to be standards. Before Moby, I was an executive at a large auto company. And we did some of the earliest blockchain DLT POCs around rideshare and usage-based insurance and sharing information on Ledger. And what we found was what everybody in the industry found at the same time, which was it was fairly easy to put a charging station or a vehicle or a bit of infrastructure on a chain, but very hard to do anything after that. It turns out the hard problem wasn't the technology, the hard problem wasn't the chain, the hard problem was getting to scale. And the reason in hindsight is very clear. It's this issue of needing to have standards, needing to have everybody doing, operating in a common way, in a common language and understanding. And that's why this fragmentation issue is a huge problem. If everybody develops, if everybody invents their own wheel, you don't end up with a car, you end up with a garage full of wheels. You have to have these common standards, and that was what led to the formation of MOBI and led to the formation of similar organizations. Many of them, TradeLens and MOBI were fairly early, but you see these types of consortiums emerging industry by industry, use case by use case. So the don't bother with your own POCs, you'll waste a lot of money and it won't go anywhere. Go join a consortium, whether it's MOBI or TradeLens or Hyperledger or any of the others. Get together. Blockchain is a team sport, as Brian Bellendorf of Hyperledger Linux likes to say. It is about the community. It's about building a minimum viable community. The standards, the equivalent of HTTP and the web browser need to be in place before your industry can take advantage of this technology.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And I think, Chris, that's a really good segue to the next section before we get to the Q&A, a call to action, if you will. So I think maybe what I'll do is I'll go to all panel members. And Nadia, let's start with you first. For the audience, what would be your call to action to all of them? What can they do in the next calendar or financial year to move us closer towards a space where digital identities are actually used and the value of being extracted?
Yeah. Yes, so it's difficult to start thinking global, right? So sometimes we need to start local with that global piece and aim in mind. So learn from other trade agreements and policies already taking a step to collaborate around interoperable trusted digital identity systems. So the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, I think it's DIPA, between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand is one such example of a regional trade agreement that now includes digital identity considerations. Really, this agreement breaks new ground in this respect. The DIPA includes a whole section on digital identities, one of the key objectives of the DIPA being to facilitate end-to-end digital trade based on safe and secure digital identities that are mutually recognized. The DIPA provisions on digital identities focus on interoperability and comparable level of protection. It's a great first step in the right direction to tackle the gaps currently in place as it pertains to digital identity. And I think DIPA can further build on that RTA with more details and practical implementation in the years to come. But if you go and look at trade agreements, regional trade agreements, those that sort of applies more immediate with a few countries, very few, if any, really, of these trusted trader schemes today addresses the issue of trustworthy identities. To my knowledge, DIPA introduced, it was last in June 2020, I think is the first to. So I would say proposed breaching among several national identification schemes. Many countries and industries, Chris, you talked about one already have digital identification schemes available that helps with trustworthy identity management, both on the organization and public authority side. So this infrastructure should therefore enable reuse of such a trustworthy identity scheme already in place. And if you think about rolling that out in trusted trader schemes. I also think that today we are just starting to see the effects and efforts around decentralized identity taking off. So while working through legislative, regulatory, and technical barriers, one needs to already think about how you can position within the possibilities that decentralized identity is offering. Blockchain-based solutions are going into production. LEY, we talked about that one earlier. I know they've done a proof of concept to experiment with decentralized technologies. But it could help going away from this siloed centralized approaches and help actually with a transition to standardize. And yes, an important piece, sorry, just to say, an important piece of that is keeping in mind that you need signatures, e-signatures attached to that. So there are some schemes out there that doesn't have that. If you want to take advantage of attaching features, documentation and other things against that digital identity, that e-signature, etc., is really important.
Thank you so much. Henrik, what would be your call to action?
I guess you probably can guess, based on my last comment, it's go do it, right? I mean there is so many benefits from the industry, cost-wise, time-wise, risk-wise, etc. That there's a clearly interest from the industry to drive the initiative. The technology is ready. I mean, whether it's blockchain or not blockchain, it really doesn't matter. And it's probably going to be a mix of a lot of different technologies, but they are ready. It is just a question of the industry making the decision. I mean, the technology is so mature, so I always say that if we started today, we probably could have a proof of concept ready within 3 to 6 months, and probably something ready in production already by year end, if needed. It is, yeah, again, taking the decision and go do it. So I mean, we have seen a lot of reports, a lot of conferences. We don't need more of this one here. We can actually get started now.
Thanks, Henrik. And Chris, on your previous point where you said, you know, join a consortia, get involved, produce standards. Any final thoughts before we move over to the Q&A?
I kind of said what my call to action. I think, look, from a policy perspective, the policymakers can do a lot too. You know, this is uncharted territory. There needs to be, you know, policymakers need to think about antitrust implications of these consortiums. I think TradeLens has just got an exemption from one regulatory body, but these are the kinds of things that regulators should do to encourage these collaborative efforts. It benefits everybody, making it the digital payments easier, central bank digital currencies, or the encouragement of private stablecoins would be another thing. So these are the kinds of things that policymakers can do.
Thank you so much. So without further ado, let's go to Q&A. There's quite a few good questions. I've kind of taken 3 out of the audience, and what I'll do is I'll read the question out, and whichever member wants to answer it can go and contribute to it. Before I do that, though, I see Luca has also posted in the chat that the UNCITRAL model law on the use of cross-border recognition of identity management and trust services may be a part of the solution, at least in the legal landscape. And I thought that is a very good one to highlight. So on the Q&A side, I'm going to start with the very first question, which is how can we, and I love this question, I've had this question quite a few times in various different conversations, how can we ensure that the physical material flow with the electronic document and approval process? So if the material sits in a warehouse and the thief scans it and sells it using blockchain, that it doesn't still just sit in the warehouse. How do we bridge these two? Who wants to give it a go?
I think this is almost based, Chris, within sort of the physical entity space.
Love that. Go for it, Chris.
I'll take a crack at it. So number one, we know that properly constructed digital IDs are not easy to hack. We have the example of Bitcoin out there, where we have $1 trillion honeypot, and that system, at least the underlying protocol, has not been able to be hacked. Now, we have to also clearly understand sort of the problem that blockchain solves and what it doesn't solve, right? Blockchain doesn't mean you can trust every bit of information you get. What it means is you can trust the history and provenance of that information and trace it back and see whether it's been changed along the way. What blockchain does is it sets up an ID for a decentralized world, right? Today's decentralized world right, is a strange mishmash of centralization and decentralization. The internet, Michael Casey calls it the original sin of the internet, is the bolting on of centralized ID authorities onto a decentralized system. And that's enabled fraud, and it's created honeypots, it's created a larger surface and incentives for attack. And it's become a huge problem, right? The most reproduced cartoon in the New Yorker magazine's history is that one of the dogs sitting in front of the computer. I think just about everybody's seen it, turning to the other dog next to him and saying, the great thing about the internet is nobody knows you're a dog, right? ID provenance is a huge problem in a decentralized world. And so you have to have secure digital IDs. That doesn't mean that the original data that was put onto the chain is correct, but at least you can trace it back. Nobody has privileged access to the root, and that reduces the not only the opportunities and incentives for fraud, but just more common error and accidental misrepresentation.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I think the next question, I think I'll go to Nadia on this one. This is all very well and good, but how do we ensure that companies in developing countries can also have affordable access to this?
Yes, now that's an extremely important question. And so I come very much from the technology side. So for me, I'm seeing all these opportunities and possibilities with technology. But we, of course, need to acknowledge that there are economic, political, and other barriers, including the global political landscape that's not perfect. There will be certain obstacles that technology and data policy cannot address. And also, the economic interests, right, by various parties that will not always have the goal of that ecosystem equitability in mind. I want to go back to technology. I mean, if you think about decentralized digital identity systems, not to disregard some of the challenges and barriers, but you actually are seeing some of the most innovative technologies happening in some of these more emerging markets where they really have an opportunity to leapfrog. I mean, they always use the example of Africa with the mobile and payment system. So for me, I think we really need to lean in and take advantage of what technology, the features that technology has to offer. So smart contracts, ability to be legally binding instruments. You have some unique privacy preserving techniques that are enabled by blockchain that allows us to build more trustworthy systems that are more immune to changing human factors. Data can be encrypted, so it's only visible by authorized parties. Yeah, so automatically encrypting, anonymizing data, transmitting data along with digital right management rules, so the data can't be used for purposes outside of these digital identity systems. I think these technology enablers, together with policy, are incredibly important to lean into leverage in a world where there are economic interests that's not always aligned, or where the political landscape might be barriers.
Thanks, Nadia. That really helped a lot. I'm going to take the last question, and it almost feels like we're going to end off where we started with Henrik. So Henrik, one of the questions that we got is, are we not at a point where internationally accepted standards can be developed? And I'm thinking a little bit about the slides that you had in the beginning, and especially the last few slides. So what would be your take on that question?
And once again, what are you talking about? Sorry, Oswald.
So the question is, are we not yet at a point where internationally accepted standards can be developed for identity?
But we are, and as I said, I don't think we need a lot more standardization. I do also envision that the way this will work is that you don't necessarily have just one global identity. I talked about the friend of a friend concept. So for example, as I said, in Denmark, we have our identities for businesses and governments. And that's going to be the same in other countries as well. But we need a kind of layer that connects those ones together. And you can also then use your G-Live, you can use your GS1 code, you can use all the different kind of codes there, which is the important part. And this is also what EU has also done with the EIDAS part, right? It is connecting the different identity schemes. And I think this is where we're gonna head. Because again, I mean, if you want to have one identity, one party issuing the identity, I mean, where should that party be placed, right? Should it be in Europe? Should it be in US? Should it be in China? Should it be in Africa? Should it be? That will give a lot of political challenges. So I merely see that we need to have something that bridges the different identities, and then it's again a question of the friend of a friend concept. I mean, if the one that you trust has actually verified that this issue, that this country has a good way to issue identities, great, then I trust this one here. And again, I did also talk about the different national jurisdiction. Maybe you trust the neighboring country, but maybe the other side, on the other continent, you don't necessarily trust that country that much. And then it's your decision. What do you want to do about that? Do you then want to take it out for manual control of that the paper is correct and do all the good old manual processes, or the bad old manual processes, probably more correct, right? But this is up to you, right? It's up to each jurisdiction to decide how much trust do we want to put in that one. And because if you wait until the world has agreed, it's going to take a lot of time. And it is, as I said, it is a bit frustrating because we don't need to wait for that one. We actually have technologies that can mitigate that. You both have that you control your identity, that the national jurisdiction makes their own decisions, that you can make your own decision about how much trust do we want to put in that one there, instead of trying to wait until the world has agreed, and that's going to take a long time. So we can actually do something now that works and that significantly will reduce the cost and time and risk in global trade.
Thank you so much for that. So I just want to thank all of the panelists for joining us today. Absolutely appreciate it. Thank you, Nadia, Chris, and Hendrik. I really think this helped quite a few people to get a sense of what identities are, the value associated with them, a little bit of insight into the fragmentation question. And I love the call to action. It's about not being afraid. It's about going ahead, you know, getting involved, using, Nadia, to your point, either the trade agreements that already exist, Chris, to your point, some of the standards already in the landscape. And then Hendrik, to your point, is like, let's not sit on our, let's move and let's actually use this. It's not just technology. We have blockchain. It works. We can move forward. And I want to end off on a note, again, from a legal perspective, when we think about identities, you know, the UNCITRAL model law on the use of cross-border recognition on identity management and trust is another area that people can start kind of moving into. Feel like all the puzzle pieces are there. Let's just assemble and conquer. So thank you. I'm going to hand over back to Emmanuel. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thanks, Oswald, and thank you all for this engaging and insightful discussion on the question of digital identities. So we'll now have a short break. We're actually going to reconvene in half an hour. We finished this session a little bit early, so that will give us time to bring the next speakers on board, and we'll have a discussion on what policy actions are being taken or should be taken to make trade digitalization a reality. So what's being made on to try and bridge the digital islands, and on the regulatory front as well. So don't leave us. We'll start again in about half an hour at quarter to 5 CET European time. Thank you.